lots of very important and special people in the room. I do want to especially acknowledge Ravi, though. He's been talking about the Fifth Estate program. The point that he hasn't made is that he is one of the stars on the program. So he is not only influencing policy and international student outcomes in Australia, but doing his bit to improve the lives of Indian students in Canada as well. So thank you, Ravi, for all that you do. I think that's a really phenomenal contribution. I'm also concerned that a lot of what I'm going to say has been already said tonight, so I'll move through it fairly quickly. But the first point to make is that we are seeing a V-shaped recovery, and this is a point that Ravi's made very clearly in his slides. We've been anticipating for some time and wondering, what will the recovery look like? You know, will it look like, in particular, the slow trek back, number 3, which is the experience that we all saw back in 2009, 2010, where it took 3, 4, 5 years. And I think when I have spoken to many of you in the last 12 to 24 months, that's our point of reference. We've always thought this is going to be a slow recovery. It's going to be really challenging. But that's not what the students said. And I think that's been the really remarkable thing about the last 2 years. Every survey that we look at, IDP, QS, lots of other surveys, they all talk about how the students are delaying, they're deferring, they're not cancelling. And lo and behold, what we have seen is that, especially in the UK, US, and Canada, they had the good fortune of a very accelerated vaccine rollout. So they opened their borders very early. And as many of you know, their academic year starts not in January, but in September. So they caught the next intake of students in September of 2021. These are the visa grant numbers, as you can see. Textbook V-shaped recovery, very deep drop in 2020 around student permits and visa grants in the UK, US, and Canada, and a very strong jump in 2021. So in some ways, I totally agree, we've got lots to celebrate in Australia, but also keeping in mind that we're 1 year late to the party and 1 year late to the recovery. What we can celebrate is that there are so many green shoots, as many of my colleagues have spoken about from this stage this evening. The first one is that I can share with you is from the Navitas Agent Perception Survey, and thank you to all of you who have completed that survey, 5 rounds now. We have round 6 out in the field at the moment, so if you haven't responded, please do. We always value your input and your contributions. But what you can see was at the start of COVID, Australia for a short time was the #1 destination when we asked whether or not there was more interest. Because of our zero COVID, we started right at the top. This was back in May of 2020. We then saw the gradual slip as many students and many parents realized that no matter how safe Australia is, you just can't get there. And that's when we started to see that decline. We've sat at the bottom until October of last year. So this was when US, UK, Canada really started to recruit very heavily and started their recovery. But finally, thankfully, in May of this year, we've seen agents now starting to really recognize once again, yes, Australia is a place of tremendous attraction and interest, and that is a really good sign. I don't need to labor the point. All of you are familiar with why that change in sentiment has come about. It's because we used to be not open and welcoming. On the left is the last year's result. On the right is this year's result. We used to be not very open and welcoming in the yellow and not very safe and stable because we were quite slow in the vaccine rollout. And we were having outbreaks late in the year when everyone else had been through most of the pandemic already. So that's been a big change. Fast forward to 2022. So what's this year been looking like? And this is, again, going back to the visa data. For January to June, in some cases, January to July. As you can see, UK, US, and Canada have not slowed down. So these are not big visa months for them. A lot of their visas come out in August, September, because that's when the academic year starts. But nonetheless, they're off to a very strong 2022 as well. So you can see the red bar was the COVID dip, the light green bar was the recovery, the dark green bar is where they're at this year, all very strong in terms of visas being granted and permits being issued. Now, what does Australia's picture look like? And again, many people have already mentioned we have seen a nice V-shaped recovery in Australia around visa grants. It's not going to be uniform across every state and every institution, and it's not going to be uniform across every country. But on the whole, it is a very strong 2022 for Australia, and I think we can all be very thankful and really recognize just the resilience and commitment of the international students. True to their word, they didn't cancel, they did delay, they did defer, and now they're coming back. I won't labor this point. I think this is a bit of an old story now, but we're all aware that visa processing always becomes an issue when you have large numbers of applications coming through. So with the good news story comes a little bit of a challenge. Again, thank you to the agent network for responding to our surveys. But what we're seeing is that when it comes to visa processing times, which is what this slide is about, Australia has been struggling a little bit. This was done back in May, so things have moved on a lot since then. But back in May, UK was doing extremely well. US normally not great on visa processing, also doing quite well. Australia in third place, and then of course, as many of you have heard, Canada is in a world of pain when it comes to visa processing. I was looking at the numbers on the IRCC website recently, and it's really difficult to get a visitor visa, let alone a study permit. So they're still working through a lot of those challenges. I think, as everyone has said this evening, credit where credit's due to the Department of Home Affairs and all of the Australian government. The response has been swift. It's been really strong, aggressive, additional staff being put on, and we're starting to see that really unlock visa grants in the last couple of months as well, which have been record-breaking months. In the interest of time, I'll keep moving through this. When we look at that Australia visa grant figure and we break it down by different countries, this is higher education offshore visa grants. As you can see on this chart, the big source markets are China, India, Nepal, Vietnam, and Indonesia. China is a surprising story from our perspective. China's actually been very slow to recover, even for the UK, US, and Canada. They've seen a big recovery, but China's been slow off the mark. It has been quite quick off the mark for Australia, and we can attribute that to, I think, two things. One was a lot of Australian institutions did very well in pivoting to online and offshore delivery. So there is a large number of international students enrolled at Australian universities that are stuck offshore. So I think a lot of this early surge are those continuing students coming back. Again, not every institution is experiencing that. It's very much concentrated in some of the group of 8 universities in particular. I won't talk too much about the issues and challenges of fraud, but just using Nepal as an example, this is, I think, a direct consequence of the uncapping of work rights that Phil and Ravi and others have talked about. The uncapping of work rights makes the study visa a de facto work visa. Some of you may be aware, Canada has gone down the same path, so they're going to face a lot of the retention challenges that we've been facing. But they've uncapped their work rights until December, so not quite as long as us, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Post-study work rights, there's no doubt that this is an important factor and an attractor, but this is some data that Phil commissioned me to look at a couple of years ago. It looks at the census, Australian census, and it maps to visa data. And what it shows is, if you're an Australian young graduate coming out of an Australian university, by and large, you're finding the right types of jobs. So if you studied health, you're working in health. If you studied IT, you're working in IT. So that's the chart on the left-hand side of the page. the red, or you're working as a manager or some other professional, which is of course what you'd expect. A small proportion, about a third in the red, are those students who are in some sort of mismatch. So they might be holding a bachelor degree, but they might still be working in sales or hospitality or something similar like that. And that goes away over time, of course, as they transition into full-time work. The challenging issue for Australia is it's great to have more post-study work rights, and adding a year and adding 2 years. That's really important for the students. It's really important for the employers. But we also need to keep an eye on the quality, not just the quantity of the post-study work rights. And the reality is, the data shows that the mismatch is much, much larger for international graduates than they are for domestic students. So again, credit to the work that Phil and others are doing to try and improve employability and employment outcomes for international students and international graduates. That's going to be really important as we give them more time to stay in Australia after they graduate. Just a really quick summary before I go into the final section of my presentation. So the V-shaped recovery is well underway. Australia's recovery is well underway, but we are sort of waiting with bated breath to see how exactly that unfolds. Visa processing is a short-term issue. We're going to get over that in time, but it is an issue for all destinations. And as I said, a lot of the policy issues that Phil and Ravi have talked about will have a really important impact on international education in Australia and our attractiveness going forward. I just want to end on a topic that I find very little people talking about at the moment, and that is the impact of COVID-19 on the next generation coming through. So if you look at the data on school closures, and many of you back in India will be very familiar with this experience, right around the world we've seen a catastrophic disruption to education that is now starting to become more and more apparent. So if you were a student in India or in South Asia, that's the bottom bar, and in Latin America, that's the other long bar, you would have missed more or less 2 years of schooling in the last 2 years of the pandemic. The disruption has been profound. Even when there was remote learning, lots of young people didn't have access to remote learning. So I'm not sure what's happened with the red circles there, but in effect, a lot of these students had normal schooling for about 5% of the last 2 years. Now that is not only are they missing out on learning, they're forgetting a lot of what they learned in previous years. So this is a significant challenge right around the world, and McKinsey has put the impact on this at about, for South Asia and Latin America, a 12-month delay in academic achievement for these students who've lived through the pandemic. So think about that. I think it's a moral issue on many levels. It's a really concerning issue. Now, the international students that come to Australia may not be 12 months behind, but they have lived through the same sort of disruption that we're talking about here. And what does that mean? That means they are different from previous generations of international students coming to Australia. They will have greater needs around perhaps their English proficiency. They might not be as advanced in mathematics as they would have been previously. Their social skills, their mental health condition. There are lots of issues that I think the international education sector in Australia needs to start paying attention to with this next generation of students coming through the pipeline. This is a simplified diagram from a report by the World Bank, UNICEF and UNESCO. They've done a combined report to talk about this disruption and in effect the trajectory of many students, particularly from South Asia and Latin America. If you can picture a young person, they were doing really well in schooling, on the way perhaps to enroll in, let's say, a law commerce double degree at an Australian institution. Along comes COVID, they're knocked off course, They're learning from home, learning from their bedrooms. They're anywhere from 3 to 6 to 12 months behind where they should be. The question is, what do they now do? Do they say, well, I can't do law commerce, maybe I just have to do commerce, maybe I have to take extra time, maybe I have to do a foundation program, a pathway program. These are all serious decisions that they have to work through, and I think all of you in the room as agents and counsellors have an incredible opportunity and responsibility to guide these students, keeping in mind their additional needs. Now, their options are, number one, as I said, settle for less. I used to be on track for this, I'm just going to have to aim lower. That's option one, and it's a very sad option for an entire generation of students. The World Bank says that because of COVID, an entire generation will see their their lifetime incomes 10% lower than what it would otherwise be. So this has long-term effects on students and their working lives. Option two is perhaps find an institution that will recognize their potential and say, look, we'll lower our entry requirements for you because we think that COVID has been pretty tough on you, and we know that you didn't have a great time finishing high school, for example. Now, this can be a double-edged sword. Let's be clear about that. If the course is still as hard as it previously was, if there isn't necessarily the additional supports, the additional mental health services, then we're not necessarily doing the students a favor by lowering the entry requirements. Third, and this will sound a little bit self-serving, I admit, coming from a pathway provider, but the reality is this is what, and we're not the only pathway provider in Australia. Every institution here, including UQ, having set up their own college recently, this is what the pathway colleges are for. They look at the individual and they say, maybe it was because you got distracted by a girlfriend in the final year of high school. Maybe it was because you had teachers that you didn't get along with, but we recognize your potential and we think that you'll thrive at our university. Here's a pathway program that will, importantly, help you catch up to your full potential. And I think that's another consideration for students and for all of us as we welcome this new wave, this new generation of international students coming into Australia. Just keep in mind, and I think we'll start to see more research come out on this. All of the sensitivity that you have, all of the personalization that you do in your counseling and individual, all of that will be more important than ever as we help this next generation navigate their transition to Australia, their transition to higher education, and catch up from the last 2 years of disruption that many of them have had to live through. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And can I have Mr. Balaji? John, I need you.